Overview of payroll and personnel cycle. The payroll and personnel cycle involve the employment and payment of all employees. The main difference between the payroll and personnel cycle and other cycles include: first, there is only one class of transaction for payroll. Second, transactions are generally far more significant than related balance sheet account. And third, internal control over payroll are effective for almost all companies, even the small ones. The account and transactions in the payroll and personnel cycle. Typical accounts in payroll and personnel cycles are shown in figures. The accounts are used to illustrate the way in which accounting information flows through the various accounts in the payroll and personnel cycle. In most systems, the accrued wages and salaries accounts in use only at the end of the accounting period. Throughout the period, expenses are charged when the employees are actually paid rather than when the labor costs are incurred. Accrual for labours are recorded by adjusting entries at the end of the period for any earned but unpaid labour costs. Definition of payroll. A payroll is the payment required to pay employees and to remit related tax to various government entities for a designated work period for which employees are entitled to receive a single payment. For example, a weekly payment indicates that employees are to be paid once a week.
These are all the documents and activities related to payroll transaction. There are a total of 10 documents. Number 1 is personnel file. Personnel file records in file data related to employees. Next, deduction form. Deduction form authorizes payroll deduction for MPF contribution. The third one is rate form. Rate form authorizes rate of pay. Next is time card. Time card record employees start and stop work during a pay period. Next is payroll check. Its function is to prepare a check in the name of an employee. Payroll register is to record amount paid to employees during each pay period.
Next, the number 7 is employees earning record. It was to record details of an employee's pay for whole financial year. Next is labor cost distribution. It was to identify gross factory earning for various account classification. For number 9 is payroll tax return, and its function is to prepare tax reform for submission to relevant government agency. Next is group certificate. It was to prepare document to give to an employee for filing with Malaysia.
Next, we will talk about the internal control objective and the specific control procedure.
The first objective of internal control is occurrence. Recorded payroll transactions are for service actually performed by non-features employees. Payroll transactions are property authorized. The specific control procedure is there should be segregation of duties of personnel, timekeeping and payroll payment. Second, there should be procedure for proper authorization and approval by the personnel department for hiring and terminating employees or for change in employee status. Thirdly, time card should be approved by supervisor and approved time card are compared with absentee reports. There should be internal verification comparing payroll with termination list. The second objective of internal control is completeness. all payroll transactions are properly recorded. The specific control procedure is payroll check should be pre-numbered and accounted for. Second, an independent employee should reconcile their payroll bank account. The third objective of internal control is accuracy. It means the payroll transactions are recorded at the proper amount. The specific control procedure is there should be internal verification entries including the review of approved rate and time cards. Gross and net payroll amount and payroll totals should be independently recalculated. The next objective of internal control is cut-off. The payroll transactions are recorded in the correct accounting period. For the specific control procedure is, there should be procedures to compare dates on payroll check and entry dates in payroll register. Lastly, the objective of internal control is classification. The payroll transactions are recorded in proper account. For the specific control procedure is, the procedure for classifying payroll costs should be reviewed.
So guys, we continue our lesson with preliminary assessment of control risk. After obtaining an understanding of the accounting and internal control system, the auditor should make a preliminary assessment of control risk at the assertion level for each material account balance or class of transaction. But before that, we should know what is preliminary assessment of control risk. So here we go. The preliminary assessment of control risk is the process of evaluating the effectiveness of an entity accounting and internal control system in preventing or detecting and correcting material misstatement. There is always some control risk because of the inherent limitation of any accounting and internal control system. The auditors ordinarily assess control risk at a high level for some or all assertions when the entity, accounting, and internal control system are not effective, or evaluating the effectiveness of the entity of accounting and internal control system would not be efficient. This is the most important thing. Auditor will not be entitled to place any reliance on internal controls based solely on the preliminary assessment of control risk. They will carry out tests of control to obtain reasonable assurance that the control on which they wish to rely were functioning both properly and throughout the period. There are three tools that we use in preliminary assessment of control risk. The first one is Internal Control Questionnaire (ICQ). The Internal Control Questionnaire we use by asking questions. There are some examples of ICQ question, which is: are customer order reviewed for terms such as prices and quantities? Is the credit department independent of the sales department? Are all credit sales approved by the credit department before shipping? Is there an approved customer list with credit rating and limits for approving credit? Does the accounting manual contain a chart of account and instruction operation for classifying sales? Are sales journals verified for correctness of entries made? Are summary total of journal entry checked monthly and approved before posting? So next we move on to the next tool, which is a flowchart. The flowchart is a graph or diagram that show the movement or the process of the product to arrive to the customer. This is the best way and easy way to understanding and effective of implementing assessment of control risk. Next is narrative on the internal structure. Narrative on the internal structure is a summary or statement that must have 5 components, which is control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring.
Okay, hi. So the next subtopic that we will talk about is test of control. Okay, what is test of control? Test of controls is an audit procedure to test the effectiveness of a control used by a client entity to prevent or detect material misstatements. Depending on the results of this test, auditors may choose to rely upon a client's system of controls as part of their auditing activities. However, if the test reveals that controls are weak, the auditors will enhance their use of substantive testing, which usually increases the cost of an audit. Okay, next, common audit procedures. Usually, audit procedures consist of these 4 items. Okay, the first one is observation. Observation consists of looking at a process or procedure being performed by others. As examples, include observation of the counting of inventories by the entity's personnel and observation of the performance of control activities. Observation provides audit evidence about the performance of a process or procedure but is limited to the point in time at which the observation takes place and by the fact that the act of being observed may affect how the process or procedure is performed. Auditors may observe a business process in action and in particular the control elements of the process. Okay, the second one is inquiry. Inquiry is an audit procedure that is used extensively throughout the audit and often is complementary to performing other audit procedures. Inquiry may range from formal written inquiries to informal oral inquiries. Evaluating responses to inquiries is an integral part of the inquiry process. Inquiry normally involves considering the knowledge, objectivity, experience, responsibility, and qualifications of the individual to be questioned. Asking clear, concise, and relevant questions, using open or closed questions appropriately, listening actively and effectively, considering the reactions and responses and asking follow-up questions, and evaluating the response. The third one is inspection the document. Inspection the document. Okay. Inspection. Auditors may examine business documents for approval, signatures, stamps, or review check marks, which indicate that controls have been performed. If the inspection approach is used, a test of controls is typically conducted for a sample of documents related to transactions that occurred throughout the year. Doing so provides evidence that the system of controls has operated in a reliable manner throughout the reporting period. Okay, the last one of the common audit procedures is re-performance. Okay, auditors may initiate a new transaction to see which controls are used by the client and the effectiveness of those controls. Okay, the next one is audit objectives. What is the objectives of test of control under auditing? Okay, The audit tests are designed to meet the control objectives and related assertions of occurrence, completeness, accuracy, cut-off, and classification. I think you guys maybe did not really know what is occurrence. Okay, let me tell you. Occurrence. All recorded payroll transactions have actually taken place. Next, completeness. All payroll transactions are processed and recorded. Okay, the next one. What is the accuracy, cut-off, and classification? All payroll transactions are recorded at their proper amounts in the proper accounting period and proper accounts. Okay. So, a test of controls is made irrespective of the dollar amount of the underlying business transaction. The main point of the test is to see if a control functions properly or not. So, the dollar amount of a transaction is not of consequence to the goal of the test. If the auditors encounter an error in a test of controls, they will expand the sample size and conduct further testing. If additional errors are found, they will consider whether there is a systematic controls problem that renders the controls ineffective, or if the errors appear to be isolated instances that do not reflect upon the overall effectiveness of the control in question.
Now, let's talk about the review of preliminary assessment of control risk. The purpose of test control is actually about the process through which the accounting and the internal control system, like policy and procedure, which in turn enable the auditor to determine the assessed level of control risk for revenue and receipt cycle accessions. Next, this slide explains about what auditor can do if audit evidence from prescribed control based on test of control for the sales and cash receipt transaction that will arise as a control failure. The answer is the auditor need to modify the nature, timing, and extent of planned substantive procedure to be performed in order to reduce a detection risk. So audit risk will be under an acceptable level. Lastly, if the audit evidence indicate that the control policy and procedure are operating effectively, the assessed level of control risk may be lower, so the substantive test may be reduced.
Next subtopic in the payroll circle is substantive test. What is substantive test? Substantive test is an activity performed by the auditor to detect fraud or material misstatement that related to the transaction or account balance. In this case, the substantive test is related to the payroll circle.
Next, we move to the type of substantive test. Substantive test has two types, which is first analytical procedures and second test of details. Analytical procedures is the comparison of data from different sources to determine if the information reported looks odd or wrong. And for the test of detail is the process of tracing figures to supporting documentation to determine if the transactions are accurate and complete.
Next, this is some of the audit program that the auditor can use in order to check the payroll transaction. First, usually the auditor will select a sample of entry from the payroll register so that they can check the hours worked to time cards, check the net pay to employees earning record, and if there is the employees who left the company, the auditor can examine employee earning record and subsequent payroll register to ensure that there is no further payment has been made to the person. Second, the auditor will observe the distribution of paychecks and obtain control of payroll sheets. And third, recalculate the gross pay, net pay, and payroll deduction for a sample of employees. This is the sum of the audit program that the auditor usually use in check the payroll transaction. This is the audit program that the auditor usually use in order to audit the payroll balance. First, the auditor will review the payroll accounts for the date payroll was last paid and recalculate the accrued wages. Second, review the tax return to the Inland Revenue Department for compliance with regulatory requirement. And third, trace total accrued payroll to payroll record. This is some of the example of audit program that the auditor can use in order to check the payroll balance.
Okay, now we are going through final exam question. Chapter 7, Audit of Financial Statement Cycle will be located at question 5 in the final exam. As for payroll cycle, I am using January 2018 question 5B. Diana Chalet Resort owned by Puan Diana. If you went through the pattern of final exam, question related to this chapter will ask you to identify what is the weakness of the internal control system, state what is the possible effect, and provide recommendation to the owner. I guess you can read on your own the full question, but I would like to highlight few key points. Firstly, if you refer to the second paragraph, the interview process is done by the head of department. Secondly, if you refer to the third paragraph, overtime is requested verbally by their supervisor during peak season. Next, overtime will be recorded on the weekly overtime sheets manually. And then if you refer to the fourth paragraph, no verification is made on the calculation of salary. And then the last one, in the fifth paragraph, payslip will only be generated upon request of the part-time staff. This is an example on how you answer the question. Firstly, you need to make a table of 3 columns, which the first column is weakness, the second column is possible effect, and the last one is recommendation. Weakness is what you notice in the internal control system. Possible effect is anything that could happen due to the weakness, and the recommendation is your suggestion on how the company could improve in the future. For example, the first weakness is interview, appointment, and distribution of check done by head of department. What is the possible effect? The possible effect is fraud. Head of department could create ghost employee in order to get extra pay for himself or herself. What is our recommendation? Our recommendation is segregation of duty should be applied. Interview should be done by the HR department. And then we see the second example. The second weakness is no verification on calculation rate of pay. What is the possible effect? The possible effect is unfair calculation and deduction could happen since no authorization from employee. What is our recommendation? 2 tier level of review should be done. Firstly, independent employee need to do the check, the review to make sure the transaction are properly recorded in the payroll. After that, the second step is manager or supervisor will do a second review and approve the payroll. And the rest of the answer you can read on your own.
Last but not least, the overall objective in the audit of payroll and personnel cycle is to evaluate whether the account balances affected by the cycle are fairly stated in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. Thanks for watching!